Welcome everybody to the Thursday night lecture. On Thursday, December 7th, Tricia McClure and 7 George Washington High School students will present Pearl Harbor Remembered. We were there. They've been doing a series of biographies that's associated with the Veterans Memorial out here and actually our online stuff. You can see a lot of them biographies actually on our website. If you go to our website, go down and click on the Veterans Memorial. It'll bring up some other search options for you, and you can take a look through those. Tonight, rail historian and author Tim Hensley will present the Norfolk and Western Railroad, its Ohio Extension and Kenova District. I grew up along the N&W in a little town called Crown. And the N&W is one of those railroads where so much passed through that area. And over the years, a lot of it has changed. I'll tell you a little bit about Tim. Tim graduated from Marshall University in 1975 with a bachelor's degree in journalism. He is a former CSX resident, vice president of West Virginia, who served more than 13 years as an Amtrak passenger engineer on the Cardinal. Proprietor of the Trainmaster's House Bed and Breakfast, his Kenova home also incorporates the offices of Pocahontas Productions, a rail and history-oriented publishing venture that first released Cass Scenic Railroad, 50 Years of State Park, A Century of Steam on Bald Knob, 2013. He and his business partner co-wrote 3 Times a Lady, a history of the N&W Class J, number 611, in 2016, and are currently working on books about the N&W Class A, 2664, and N&W stations. Hensley also writes a quarterly column for Rail Fan and Railroad Magazine. Please welcome Tim Hensley.
Okay. Thank you all. Thank you, Randy. He and the staff up here have been after me for several years to come up and do a little presentation. I first put this together back in 1992, the 100th year anniversary of the Ohio Extension. We had the Norfolk and Western Historical Society convention in Williamson, so I put that together and made a presentation, so it's still, after all these years, blew a little dust off, and it still serves to tell the story. I was born in Kenova, and both my grandfathers were railroaders. I had one grandfather was a C&O engineer, but I had the pleasure of being a young brakeman and fireman for engineers and conductors that had come up under him. My other grandfather was killed on the N&W in 1926 on the belt line at Kenova in a freak accident that inadvertently involved Henry Ford. Left my grandmother with 4 little girls to rear in the Great Depression. How they made it, God only knows, but they were all very close to me, and they're all gone now. But I grew up in Kenova during the last days of N&W steam, and I could look down off the hill where I lived and see the trains below, and occasionally my dad would take me down to the Kenova Union Station to watch the Powhatan era come in with the Streamline Class J. And then I went to the 1st and 2nd grade in Kenova at Ferndale Elementary, and I could look right out my window and watch in the 1st and 2nd grade and watch the steam locomotives take water, and I was reprimanded occasionally for slipping across Route 75 and hanging out in the yard office, but it kind of inspired a lifelong interest in the railroad. Willis Cook was C&O's PR man in Huntington, and he lived about 3 doors from me, and he took me under his wing and nurtured me, taught me a little bit about photography. I got an interest in journalism and pursued the degree in journalism. found out you couldn't make a living at it. I worked on the Williamson Daily News for about 6 months, and then I worked 3 years for Congressman Ray Hall, and I hired on with the railroad. One of the first jobs I had was a midnight hostler at Hanley, and I worked with Rick Aguilar here. He's from up in that area, and we worked many shifts together and whatever. But I got over, I became an engineer in less than 2 years after I hired with the railroad, which was unheard of in those days. And then I got involved in safety committees and things, and I took a leave to edit the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers publication in Cleveland. I did that for 2 years, and then the company came to me and asked me to take a position, and I did, and I became a feature writer and traveled all over the railroad from Huntington. Many times I wrote 3/4 of CSX News from right there. Had a really great boss. Soon became regional manager of corporate communications, and then director of state relations and resident vice president, all within 3 years. I worked for a very good guy. I was a native of South Charleston, Dan Green. He was active in state government here back in Rockefeller's administration. So he was a great fellow to work with, and West Virginia was a very important state to CSX, and still is. But I got to do everything from pull a dead engineer from a wreck that he caused as a chemical fire burned all around. You remember the big scary wreck, Rick? So, and did everything from that to personally being in charge of a major visit from the President of the United States. I was the primary White House and Secret Service contact when Bill Clinton came to Huntington and kicked off his re-election campaign there, and we put the train together to Chicago to the Democratic National Convention. And I won't go into it, but I've got anecdotes and stories about all this along the way, but in the sake of brevity, we'll skip over that tonight. I got real interested in the Kenova district of the N&W between Portsmouth and Kenova, and particularly because of the steam engines and the traffic and whatever. So I was a little more mature when I started Marshall. I'd been in the Army. First time I went to college, I stayed about 3 weeks and was all torn up over some girl, and I quit. So, but I settled down after I was in the Army and came back, and I put together a poster, and I would go out in the afternoons, and I went all up and down that old line and the big sandy line from Kenova to Williamson. I put these in every church, every country store, any gathering place, post offices, whatever, in an effort to seek material on the old line, as they called it. And so I got a lot of info out of that. Never did get a picture of the old passenger train out there or any really good pictures of the roundhouse at Kenova, but it served its purpose. Another thing that I did was I started oral history tapes, and I would go to Portsmouth and Williamson and Kenova and Bluefield and Roanoke and Crewe, Virginia, and all these gentlemen that operated these trains and ran these locomotives. I would make tapes of them, and I would tell them, look, you know, I know the dry history that this was built in such and such a time and date, and I said, I'm really looking for something more. And I'd say, you remember any unusual little anecdotes or incidents that happened? And I would have seniority lists of the men with me, and I'd go, yeah, that guy, he did this and this happened to him, or he was involved in that. And then I'd go down the division place by place, you know, from an employee's timetable, and yeah, this happened there, yeah, that took place there or whatever. And that way I got into some really good anecdotes and tales and different things to blend into my writing. So when I retired 3 years ago, I started to get back to my writing. I have the publishing venture. We did the cast book. You can buy that in the gift shop here. It's still in print. And we did a book on the Class J engines at N&W, and that sold out in 6 months. So I started to put a lot of those anecdotes into that and these tales, and I've got kind of a folksy flair, I suppose. I won the award for the best magazine writer when I was at Marshall. So also have a bed and breakfast. Take one of the brochures, feel free when you leave. I have a Smithsonian quality exhibit of railroad artifacts in my house, and have quite a collection and also archives, and someday that may end up here at the state, who knows. But a friend died, Lloyd Lewis, 2 years ago, and I bought most of his collection from his son, and then I helped his son market the rest of it. So he was able to get about $35,000 out of all I was able to help him sell and whatever. So, but I've been involved 2 years with that. He had like 7 storage lockers of things, big storage lockers, and it was just trash thrown in among treasure. So with that, that'll serve as a good introduction, and I'll get into my presentation. The Norfolk and Western Railroad had its beginnings in 1838 when the little 9-mile City Point Railroad was constructed between Petersburg and City Point down on the James River. Over the years, the Virginia and Tennessee Railroad was started out of Lynchburg toward Bristol in 1852, and along with the Norfolk and Petersburg and South Side, the 3 railroads were eventually combined into the Atlantic, Mississippi, and Ohio under the auspices of General William Mahone in 1873. And that lasted until 1881 when it went into receivership and emerged as a product of the Clark interest, Philadelphia financiers, into the Norfolk and Western Railroad. And it was primarily an agrarian railroad from Norfolk to Bristol, 408 miles, and then they got a merger with the Shenandoah Valley Railroad, but it hauled cattle and grains and tobacco and various products of the South. Even its headquarters down through the years had a southern flair in Roanoke. When it became the Norfolk and Western, as did the C&O from Richmond, when it originally came from Huntington. So a lot of your railroad people, particularly in the southern part of the state, were originally southern people, even as far as Portsmouth, Ohio, and places like that. That was settled by a lot of Virginians. N&W eventually called itself Precision Transportation, is what their slogan was. That's a Class A locomotive. That was their time freight engine that could also pinch hit in passenger trains. They had 42 of those. That's the Cavalier at Kenova back in 1957, and if you can look way on down there toward the tower, that's my dad and I standing there. A gentleman by the name of Bruce Myers took this picture, and as I said, my dad would take me down there occasionally, and I can tell by the blue shirt and the white shorts that he wore. So that was kind of his trademark, and I had a T-shirt on, if you draw that up. But These engines were built in Roanoke. There were 14 of them. They were called the finest steam passenger engines ever built. That's the 602. When I was a little boy, we didn't think it was the Powhatan era unless it had the 606 on it. But I was later fortunate to have a friendship with Bob Clater, who was chairman of Norfolk Southern, and I kind of had carte blanche to run their steam program and do what I wanted, and I got to run the 611 for 4 times, twice for 150 miles on ferry trips when they would just move the equipment. They would call me and ask me if I wanted to run, and naturally I said yes. But that's kind of what I grew up with. There's the A on Time Freight 77. I grew up on the hill there in the background, and I could look down and see the trains. The old doctor that brought me into this world, he had a pair of binoculars, and I would climb up there in the evenings, and we would sit up there in his picture window and watch the parade of trains on the C&O and N&W. This is what I could see out my first and second grade window. That's my first grade window. I shot that when the 1218 was in excursion service. And that's the yard office, that brick building with the glass cinder block windows. And there was a water tank over there about the front of that locomotive and a standpipe where they'd take water. So my attention was often more on the locomotives than my reading, writing, and arithmetic. Had an old teacher in the second grade, Thelma Piles. She didn't like that very well. I'd have drawings of the steam engines, little stick drawings, and she'd wrap me with a ruler on my knuckles. So some of the kids I went to school with still remember that. This is from the high side. This is number 15, the Cavalier, which was the first-rate day train until the Powhatan era came along in 1946. But that's the 603. The bridge at Kenova is the longest on the N&W. Each one of those spans on each side are longer than a football field. They're 304 feet long, and that curved top on the middle there you see, it's 521 feet. So that was one of the top 10 targets of the Germans during World War II. They kept a Coast Guard detachment assigned there to guard the top and the bottom with it, as did the railroad head guards with 30-30 rifles. Here's Santa Claus at Kenova back in the 50s. One of the clerks out of Roanoke, J.I. Kelly, would dress up as Santa Claus and ride the trains for a couple weeks, and the railroad would promote that. And people would come down and to the depot there. There was a baby born in that freight elevator in 1926 that a woman went into labor, and they got her off the train. She was delivered in the brick freight elevator that you see there, yellow brick. That's the yard office where I hung out in the water tank. That was built in 1952, replaced the old yard office. The men would save copies of the N&W magazine for me, so I still have those. In fact, I ended up with a complete set. This, I have the number plate off this engine, the 101. I can remember one Sunday, one of my classmates' friends, and also he was a classmate of my mother. He was an engineer on the yard there in Kenova, and he took us on a tour one Sunday, and I can remember getting up on these K1 engines. They were constructed as a passenger locomotive and relegated to local freights. In later years, they kept one at Kenova for the Kenova to Williamson local freight that went down one day and back the next. There's the tower, KX tower, that controlled from Pritchard, West Virginia to Union, Ohio. I hung out there many days with the operator and Okie Billups, and he lived across the street from where I now live. But again, there's the infamous Class J locomotive. They're really beautiful. The 611 is refurbished in excursion service now. Don't know what the future is going to hold, but it's been run in the last 2 years. They put it away in '94, and then they got it back out. It ran 12 years before in excursion service. Retired in 1959. And that's the poster that I have there that I was holding. And that's when I really started in earnest to research this old line. This is an old gentleman with the name of George Smith, and he was about 92. He started as a call boy at Kenova back in 1897. And he was really full of tales and anecdotes, and a couple of my lanterns there. I have the finest collection of N&W lanterns in the country. The globes are marked. You can see that one, the lower one, you can see the N&W on the globe there. But he was quite the character, and had a lot of different tales and anecdotes. He asked the train master to give him a job braking as it was call boy, and he told him to come back when he was 18, and he did, and he said, if you want to brake, he said, I'll let you break your damn neck. And that was quite a dangerous occupation in those days. For air brakes, they had to ride the top of the cars and tighten the handbrakes down with brake sticks, and that was one gentleman said his sister kept a sheet for the express purpose of wrapping his remains. This old gentleman on the right here is Walter Carter. He lived to be 101, and he and I got to be good friends. I have about 6 hours of tapes. He's an old Virginian that came out to Portsmouth in 1910. That's W.P. Harris that he's with there. And Walter boarded in my home in the 20s when they were double tracking the Big Sandy line, so I have a lot of his artifacts and whatever. The call boy would come around and throw pebbles up on the window so he wouldn't disturb the rest of the household. 2 N&W train masters lived in my house, so that's why I call it the train master's house. This is an early timetable that was in effect about the time they built the Ohio extension of the N&W. They started from Kenova in 1890 and from Elkhorn, and built simultaneously towards one another. And this shows the N&W before the Ohio extension. It had extended up out of Radford and a few branch lines and whatever. Hadn't even quite made it to Bluefield then. But it was built into Bluefield and Pocahontas in 1883. And the gentleman that was the father of all that was Frederick J. Kimball. He had been a Philadelphian, and he went to Renova, Pennsylvania. He was a civil engineer, and he put it all together for the Clark interest. He was intrigued by the infamous Pocahontas No. 3 seam of coal that is down in McDowell and Mercer counties, and he dug a penknife. There was a gentleman at Abbs Valley that was a blacksmith, and that's what started it all, and grew into the great coal carrier. This shows the N&Ws that eventually grew. It was finally completed, the last physical part of it, in 1901 when they took over the Cincinnati, Portsmouth, and Virginia, between Cincinnati and Portsmouth. And it changed the character of the railroad from a southern agrarian road to a mighty Pocahontas coal carrier and major Midwest Atlantic trunk route. You can see all the branch lines in West Virginia there, southern West Virginia, that reached like the tentacles of an octopus to tap all the rich seams. This is an early locomotive down at Sardinia of the Cincinnati, Portsmouth, and Virginia, 440 type. This is the Cuyahoga Valley Pass, and the N&W bought the Cuyahoga Valley between Coal Grove and Columbus in 1890. When it went into receivership, they bought it at public auction. It is what inspired them to complete the high extension to connect to it from the Bluefield Elkhorn area on through, and the construction of the Kenova Bridge. And it was constructed under the auspices of the West Virginia and Ironton Railroad. They would often have a guise to kind of hide what they were doing, and this found that out at the courthouse at Wayne, that they'd issued to one of the contractors. There were 15 contractors that worked on the Ohio extension, and about 5,000 men and a multitude of mules and carts and dynamite. This is an early picture at Kenova as the bridge was being completed, about 1891. You can see the old Glenwood Hotel under construction there. Parts of that is still standing. It was constructed of stone and brick. The N&W had kind of a land company subsidiary and a hotel subsidiary. They had the Bluefield Inn and the Maple Shade Inn at Pulaski, Virginia, and the Radford Inn. So the Hotel Roanoke, which is still in operation today. But they went around to all these places and constructed hotels and whatever. This is an early train on the high extension. On a Sunday, they had an excursion out of Bluefield and out beyond Elkhorn to observe the progress that was being made in the construction. A 440 type locomotive, and that's done out of the white system of classification. You see the two driving wheels there and the two pony trucks on the lead, and you double that on each side, and that's how you get the 440 wheel arrangement designation. This is at Buffalo Creek, out in back of Kenova, in Wayne County. Early water tank and locomotive that was used during the construction of the high extension. Here's a local timetable that went into effect with the Cuyahoga Valley and Kenova divisions in 1891. Before they completed the extension, they had a mixed train out to Dunlow, as you can see there. And it went, they had a Y track out there, and they'd go out and turn it and whatever, but it would deliver construction supplies as well as develop trade along the route. You see a lot of these places, Genoa, that was near where my grandfather was from, Fleming, Ferguson, Dunlow. The old depot at Dunlow still stands. And this is the first train over the High River Bridge at Kenova, all decorated up with bunting and whatever. This is the first train to run through when the high extension was officially completed on September 22nd, 1892. This was made on September 24th of 1892 at the west end of Dingus Tunnel. And that day is my birthday, so I feel some kindred spirit to my calling. This carried Major Sands, who was the right-hand man of Frederick Kimball, through on an inspection train to look over the work. Had you been a passenger on one of those early trains, this is what one of your passes would have looked like. They were issued to various people complimentary that they did business with for the railroad and whatever. Had clergy tickets and things of that nature. I have a complete N&W pass collection from 1881 all the way up into passenger service in the mid-1960s and 70s. This is an early train out about Nolan. That tall gentleman there was H.K. Elliott, the conductor. Again, that's a 440 type, and he founded the Norfolk and Western Veterans Association. He moved to Columbus in later years, and he had to run from Columbus to Kenova over the Cuyahoga Valley Division. But they established a division headquarters at Kenova and completed a really nice two-story brick Union Station in 1894, and the upstairs was for the offices of the Kenova Division. The Kenova Division extended from Kenova to Gray, which is now Lindsay, down below Williamson and Devon, and the Pocahontas Division extended from Gray to Bluefield. In 1901, they moved the terminal and established it at Williamson, and the crews ran from Williamson to Portsmouth and from Bluefield to Williamson. You see various meets of trains and whatever. Ferguson Coal Track and Radnor, Fleming. Coleman is where my grandfather, that was an N&W yard conductor, that's where he was from. Right near Wayne there. This is the Union Station at Kenova, and you can see the tower out there at the west end of the platform, and the sheds and the lower tracks serve the C&O, but those upper offices, it was built in two stages. You can see a discoloration of the brick there above the Georgian rounded windows with the keystones, and that part was later added on. The part over on the right was what was original, and that second story was expanded in later years, early before the turn of the century. This gentleman in the chair there is David Harvey Barger. He was the first superintendent of the Kenova Division, and he was from Shawsville, Virginia. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the estate of Walnut Cove down there, that big brick antebellum mansion over on the right of 460 with all the pasture land and whatever and the fencing. That was his property. He was also in the coal business, and he had a bakery in Bluefield, and he had a mill on his property down there at Shawsville, and had a famous flour. The gentleman over on the right is Joseph Robinson, sitting, and he was superintendent of the Cuyahoga Valley Division. But Barger he was called Black Barger. He's about 6'4", and started as a conductor on the old line. Later was general claim agent on the N&W before he left the railroad. Here's an early view of the single track bridge from the high side at Kenova. Quite a bottleneck when they later double tracked the railroad in 1907. pretty much had it double tracked all the way from Norfolk to Columbus. And with a few single track exceptions, the bridge being one of them. And here's the different passenger trains that operated early over the Soda Valley Division in the Kenova. Had a Pullman Palace car sleeper from Chicago to Kenova daily. So that was quite a posh thing for a train to have in those days, those early rudimentary days. This is one of the waybills of the Cincinnati, Portsmouth, and Virginia. They call it the Pocahontas route. That's the part that extended from Portsmouth to Cincinnati. And you see they mentioned Kenova and Ironton. This is at Nolan, West Virginia, and early passenger train. The local that went up the old line, as they say. This is a clergyman's ticket from Wayne to Coleman. That's where my grandfather was from, Coleman, as I previously said. And from 1895, when they tore the station at Wayne down in the 70s, I found that down in the framework of it. So that was quite a find. And this is Coleman, little flag stop they had there. And the road as you see it, which was 52 and for many years, 152, and quite a rich place in heritage. Here's Barger's Pass that he got from Cincinnati, Portsmouth, and Virginia. Again, he was the first superintendent at Kenova. This is a CP&V train, Cincinnati, Portsmouth, and Virginia, down at Sardinia, Ohio, 260 type. And this is a reflection of the time they moved the headquarters of the terminal to Williamson. That's the first roundhouse they had at Williamson. One time they had 3 roundhouses standing at Williamson back in the 40s. But that's similar to the roundhouse at Kenova. It was originally 16 stalls, and then some of it was moved to Columbus, and it remained 8 stalls for most of its life. Here's an early picture of Williamson and the original station. And later on, back in the 10s and the teens, we see the second roundhouse down there has been constructed, and the older one was for the smaller engines. And there's a view of the business section of Williamson as it started to burgeon. And the yards, pretty much that area remains as it is today. The leads and everything are similar. Downtown Williamson. I also have quite a collection of postcards between, I collected all of West Virginia for a while, but I sort of honed it down to the railroad and the Pocahontas coal fields. I have several huge albums of coal fields between Kenova and Bluefield that reflect the coal field area. First National Bank of Williamson in the early days. Second Avenue. Some of those buildings are still standing. That's in the area of the old Ball Funeral Home over on the left there. And the station that was built in 1907 at Williamson, it still stands today. That's the City Hall. It was constructed, and then in 1926 it was moved due to some viaduct work and whatever that took place. But that's kind of a standard N&W brick, first class combination brick design, as they called it. Borderland Collieries, an early view of that. That was owned by a gentleman by the name of Stone from Roanoke that had Stone Printing. And the railroad had a coaling station there where they could take coal. The actual mine was over in Kentucky, and in Pike County. And this mine, it lasted on up into the 50s, but it had some early labor troubles. And the Stone interest and Roanoke interest divested of it. This is Matewan. There's the depot on the upper right there. I did a reconstruction of the depot for Massey Energy, the Matewan Depot replica in the museum. I did that for Don Blankenship. I had beat him in the legislature several times on the overweight coal truck bill, and he had respect for me. A lot of people don't like Don, but he was good to me. And he wanted to do something for the area, and he wanted to reconstruct the depot. So we did that on over in the left here area, and that still stands today. Unfortunately, we did a Smithsonian quality presentation, and they haven't done much with it since. They've kind of let it go to seed. This is Thacker, which was an early hub of what became Mingo County. Thacker Coal and Coke. Not much left there today, but some of the buildings are still up the hollow. This is at Canterbury on the old line. The original Norfolk and Western route that was constructed up 12 pole via Wayne, Dunlow, and Dingus. There's an old train order that was written from Canterbury. It kept pushers there. The grade up to the Dingus Tunnel was really tough on westbound coal trains, and there were several pushers that were kept down at the bottom of the hill. And there's one of them, 303. I have a lot of oilers like that gentleman has, the old long-necked oilers, handmade. That was a symbol of pride of the engineers. Tenors would make those and put their names on them, and so you can see there's a couple pushers in the siding waiting to shove trains up over the mountain. And this is looking west at Canterbury. This is all abandoned now. It was abandoned in 1933 between Wayne and Lenore. Another of the shelter shed at Canterbury. Here's a wreck up along the 12-pole line in the old days. I never have been able to document anything specific as to where that was, and I research these things pretty hard, so just haven't been able to find it. That's the engine down 12-pole there. Had several notable wrecks out there with loss of life to the trainmen in particular. This is the section force at Ardell. The old signs had the difference between Columbus and Norfolk. If anyone knew Lowell Cade was the sports editor of the Herald-Dispatch, that was his grandfather. That was John Cade, that was the section foreman sitting on the car there. old lever cars, they call it. Some people call it a hand car, but the railroad officially called it a lever car. This is at Wayne, 280 Class G type engine. Crew had a water tank at Wayne and a coaling station, and trains backed up. That's a seal freight going east. This is at Kenova. That's a engineering force. In 1902, the gradient of the old line and the restrictions on coal that it caused, and how crooked it was, and how the timber and coal reserves never played out as they were projected by Aspinwall and Lowe and some of the other people. There were very few mines that ever really developed out there. They had a Hope Splint Coal Company at Ferguson, and one at Dunlow, and a Pearl Mining at Dingus. But it was a lot of it was cannel coal, and after the timber was harvested, there wasn't a whole lot to generate traffic along the way. So in 1932, this was taken in 1903 at Tunnel 3, they started construction of the Big Sandy line between Kenova and Naugatuck. And it was open to traffic on December 15th, 1904. And there was a gentleman with a cut out around the area between Crum and Webb, down in that area, down in Randy's territory down there. And this, they had an old gentleman by the name of Harlow that was a section foreman, and he had suffered a accident in train service and lost his leg, and he had a wooden peg leg. And there was a mule that was used in the construction of this Big Sandy line, and some type of a devastating injury happened to it, and apparently they tied dynamite around its head and dug a hole for it and let it down into the hole, and I guess it was spooked by the fuse, and it came up out of the hole and toward the old man Harlow, and he was hobbling around on his peg leg and hollering, "Head that mule, head that mule." And all the men would tease him about that for years, and every time they'd see him, and they'd get back and hide somewhere and holler, "Head that mule." This gives you a good understanding of the old line and the new line. This old part over on the right there, as I said, that was opened in 1892. And then over on the left, that Big Sandy line between Kenova and Naugatuck, it was opened to traffic in 1904. The part out to East Lynn was constructed as the Big Sandy, East Lynn, and Guyenne Railroad, a little short line by the Perry interests. And N&W took that over in 1907 and 8. And once they opened this new line over on the left, all the mainline passenger trains were moved over there, as was the westbound coal traffic and the more important time freights. And as they returned from the Midwest back to the mines, the old line over on the right was used as an eastbound double track. And the empties came back that way, as well as the lesser seal freights. There was a local freight established every day, and also a local passenger train between Kenova and Williamson. 27 and 28, and that lasted up until the old line was abandoned in 1933. But if you'll look at Wayne there and then go down and locate Lenore down near Nolan and Naugatuck, there was a branch line built out from Lenore called the Pigeon Creek Branch. And they abandoned the old line between Wayne and Lenore in 1933 and turned the roadbed over to the state. And that was part of the original highway, and some of it you can still drive on out there today. Bridges, they've replaced a lot of the bridges recently, but a lot of the old girder bridges and everything were still there. This is Portsmouth. When it was established as a big terminal at Kenova's expense, the main shops were moved out of Kenova and moved over to Portsmouth. You can see a full circle roundhouse there in the left center, and then the back shop is the long building over there on the right, and that lasted, it's still standing today, and lasted up into steam, and it assisted Roanoke with the major rebuilding. Original division office and an old 060 switch engine at Portsmouth. This is a shay that was made for Elkhorn Mountain there. It was used on the hump at Portsmouth, the engine in the foreground there, the 56. And you can see the hump there behind those three engines together. But that was his last duty, was to work Portsmouth. More of the facilities at Portsmouth. And the Kenova district, as it became, and which entertained my primary interest, extended from Williamson through Kenova to Portsmouth. And still very much a mainline railroad today with double stack trains and automobiles, solid trains, automobiles every day, and a lot of traffic on it. An old timetable back in the early years, I think it's 1908. This is a section force at Wayne under Walter Purdue, the gentleman in the bowler. The two Lindsay brothers, the two Negro gentlemen. There was a gentleman named Lindsay, one of their relatives that fed the crews at Wayne, and they were the only black family that lived there. But Lindsay, as they called him, I won't repeat what they called him, but that's the way things were in those days. And the crews would order ahead, and that's the only chance they had to eat between Portsmouth and Williamson. And they'd wire ahead, and he'd have baskets of fried chicken and whatever for them. This is lining the Dingus Tunnel in 1914 with brick. You see the platforms and everything. It's completed out and done between 1907 and 1914. Some of the first signals on the N&W were up the Dingus Tunnel, and that's at the west end. Of course, you can drive through the tunnel today. It's got quite a reputation. There's the station at Dingus. One time they were hunting moonshiners, and a sack of sugar opened up, and they followed the trail of the sugar to find the still. A lot of moonshining going on. It's pretty mean up in there. Breeden and Dingus were very mean areas. Still are today to some extent. This is Governor Hatfield's special. I believe it was 1912 when he ran for governor, and shows his special train at Wayne Courthouse, Dunlow, Breeden, Cerrito, Buffalo Creek, Dixon. I found that out in the old depot at Dunlow. Quite an interesting piece. There's a station at Lenore. This is Mr. and Mrs. McCain, and they both later moved to Kenova. I talked with the old lady there on the left on her deathbed, but they were both telegraphers on the railroad, and they were at Naugatuck, and they would ride number 27 on a Sunday up to Lenore and walk back to Naugatuck. That was their Sunday ritual. This is at Naugatuck, Y-class locomotive with a westbound coal train. You can see the tire just beyond the locomotive there at the west leg of the Y. There was a Y track there after the big Sandy line was opened. That tire has been long gone, probably gone since the 30s. This is at Chatteroy, down near Williamson. The N&W had some fuel mines down there called Howard Collieries. They had fuel mines at Vulcan and Pond Creek, and Howard Collieries at Chatteroy, and for a while at Keystone. They found it cheaper to mine their own coal for locomotive fuel. They sold it commercially as well. I've got some script that says from each of these places, it says like Vulcan Collieries of N&W Railway and Howard Collieries of N&W Railway, Pond Creek Collieries of N&W Railway. Another view of Williamson as it started to expand. It's the YMCA at Williamson. That was built in 1907. That's where the crews stayed, and you could get anything from a haircut to, there was a commissary and ran by Virginia Supply on the bottom where you could buy your overalls and whatever you need. Served excellent meals. Ran by a man with the name of W.H. Weaver. I made a tape of him, and he had a lot of interesting stories about the shenanigans that went on inside and whatever. In 1912 and 13, they double-tracked the Kenova Bridge, and they just built a new structure around it and didn't even stop traffic. And they averaged a train over the bridge about every 15 minutes. But there's some of the steel work laid out and whatever. And there it is, building the new structure around the old, out in the main channel. There's the new bridge and the little side area there for the construction locomotives to get off and out of the way and around it. And the 1913 flood caused a little havoc with it. That's over in the area of Beach Street, right near the Pumpkin House down there, if anybody's ever been to the Pumpkin House that Rick Griffith has. But it's on down the street to the right there. And there's the finished product. They kept a bridge watchman there. That lasted up into the 60s. And he had a phone line to the tire and the yard office at Kenova. And part of his duties, they had sand out there. And he would hump that sand up around the rail, and after each train passed, he would go inspect that to see if it were any wider than the normal length. And that would tell them they had a loose wheel or whatever. All that's done electronically now, but that's sort of the old days that you could see. And he would, the tire operator could inspect the train on the far side, and he would have to come over as the train passed to the downriver side. This is a fire at Williamson, 1907. near the depot area. More Williamson from the west end. That's pretty much the depot as it ended up and as it was moved in its present location today. There's an old Z-class locomotive with a time freight coming out. Now one of those platform lamps that you see there, I have one in my front yard. It came from the platform at Williamson. And it says NW Railway on it. This is out at Breeden. Had a water tank out there in a pond, and it was a very rough area. Had a rough bunch of Markhams that lived out there. And they had an old, going back to Wade Markham and his sister and all that, and they burnt one another's mill. And because they were jealous of the other getting too much toll, and they said Uncle Wade rode his mule, and Sis was sitting on her front porch rocking and crocheting, and said he spat and said, "You burnt my mill, didn't you, Sis?" And I said she never missed a gate, and said, "Yes, Giddens," said, "You burnt mine." And but they had a offspring by the name of John B. Markham, and there were some special agents killed up there, and it was a right mean place. They would harass the train crews and different things. This is Irita Markham there. She had a store up there, and she loaned me these pictures. She was brother to John B. Markham. Tunnel guards during World War II at the Dingus Tunnel. And various trains out there during the double tracking of Big Sandy in 1925. They kept about 26 work trains that would come back into Kenova on the weekends. But on the night of December 5th, 1920, Captain Brockus from the State Police and John Sutphin and other detectives at NW, they made a night run with a crew up to Breeden, and they were after Ira McLeod and John B. and a little fellow named Cornbread Dent that carried a 6-shooter as big as he was, they said. He's only about 5'6". And I had an interview with him too. And anyway, John B. jumped off the engine, and John B. Markham, and as Mr. Carter told me, he said they shot him in the air like a squirrel. And that put an end to all the shenanigans up there. They'd robbed the crews and the shanty cars, and they were awfully tough on blacks. There was a gentleman named Wilson D. Kirk that lived at Missouri Branch. He later operated a filling station, and he told me the last month that he worked on the section up there that they found 3 dead Negroes hanging in the fence line. So it was really a rough, tough area. And one time Sutphin was after Cornbread Dent, and he was down in a gondola, and they were shooting at one another, and Sutphin, the special agent, was on the running board of a tank car, and he didn't have anywhere to take cover, and he dropped off at Dingus and went down into Logan and caught the C&O back to Kenova. And years later, in the 40s, Mr. Dent had taken a dose of religion by then and whatever, and he said the old man Sutphin came by him, looked at him, stopped, and turned around, looked at him, and motioned for him to come out on the vestibule. He said they went out there and said Sutphen shook the cigarette pack and gave him a cigarette and lit his cigarette for him, and they both lit up, and he said, told him, he said, Cornbread, said, I'd done my level best to try and kill you one time. Said they shook hands, and said, Dent said, he looked him right in the eye and said, brother, I'd done the same. So that was quite a thing back in those days. Again, the tunnel guards that were there on World War I in the Dingus Tunnel. Here's a double tank on one of the work trains that they started double tracking the Big Sandy line in 1924 and completed it in 1926, and that more or less relegated the old line, the old 12-pole line, to a branch line. And all they had on it was the local passenger train and the local freight. They would route trains over it in an emergency, but it was abandoned between Wayne and Lenore in 1933. This shows some of the bridge work and double tracking the Big Sandy line. That's out in the area of Needle and Cyrus. Williamson from the East End. And the Great White Way, as they call downtown Williamson. You can see a sign from the motor company there. The Mountaineer Hotel, built in 1927. Henry Ford and John Kennedy and many other notables stayed there. Henry Ford had captive mines across from Williamson at Stone, Kentucky. Fordson Coal Company. They were managed by Edsel, and he would periodically run a Ford dealer special from Detroit to Norfolk and stop along the way and inspect these mines, and that's how my grandfather got killed. There was a Ford dealer special on February 18th, 1926. Some of the men on his crew wanted to slip off and see that. All the trains at Kenova stopped, and the car inspectors went over back in those days up until 1942. On every passenger train, had like 10 minutes in the station. And they wanted to try to get a glimpse of him on his private car, the Fairlane. He continued to switch down below on the belt line. Someone was running the engine that wasn't qualified to do so. Came down on top of him with the draft of cars too hot. He was breaking in a new man. He told him to go down the side ladder. He jumped down in the gondola widthwise pipes and hits hard. The load shifted and mashed him. Lived about 6 hours and he died. There's the second roundhouse at Williamson. And some of the coal camps. Aflex and various ones. See the colors of red and green and of course white and kind of a cream with black were trim colors. Here's a timetable from the 1929. NW had introduced the Pocahontas and the Cavalier in 1926 and 27, their first name trains, and they were updated with luxury equipment. This is at Kermit. The old depot. F.G. Staker was the agent, and he had a son, Zane Gray Staker, that was a notable attorney at Williamson. I don't know whether any of you ever recall seeing the series Hawkins on law with Jimmy Stewart, about a country lawyer from West Virginia. But that was, it had about maybe 6 episodes, I don't know, late 60s, early 70s, but that was based on Zane Gray Staker, and I know some of his people. But I had an interview with the old man. He was quite a character, and Andy Scott lived right across the alley from me in Kenova, was his clerk. He passed away last year. This is number 20, a local between Kenova and Williamson daily. stopped at Kermit with 591 and E1 locomotive. I had the 597 number plate, and that's down in the Make One Depot replica museum. They really butchered that down there from what our graphic layout was and whatever. We really did a nice job on it when it first opened. Another view of the station at Kermit gives you an idea of people waiting around to see the trains and see who was coming and going. That was kind of a favorite hangout in the community. The station at Kenova shows you trains of 3 railroads. Had about 30 trains a day. That's the N&W on the upper level, the C&O over on the right, and then a B&O train is back down into the platform there. They had a shed and a brick platform. The B&O trains, they had 2 each way between Kenova and Pittsburgh, and 2 between, 1 between Kenova and Wheeling, and 1 each way between Kenova and Parkersburg. And that lasted the B&O service up to about 1957, although they moved on up the street. But that was quite a place, and people from the penitentiary and the Hatfields and all would change trains there. Wasn't uncommon to see men in shackles, and there was a murder there, and like I said previously, a birth there, so it was quite a place. Torn down in 1976. I got a few things from it. This is the station over at Ironton. It's now a restaurant called the Depot. It closes and opens back up periodically. There were 3 stations similar to this. A larger one to this design at Roanoke, which is still there, and that's now the Visitor Center and the O. Winston Link Museum. I wrote Link's book, Steam, Steel, and Stars. But there's one at Petersburg too, so all 3 of this design are still standing. This is down at the Hatfield tank in the winter of 1930. Y-class engine coming east, railroad east, south sort of. And another timetable they updated to in the 1930s. This was about the time they abandoned the old line. The Interstate Commerce Commission sanctioned a series of pictures to show with the abandonment case. And these Prestons had a store and everything out there. He worked on the railroad. I've got a tape of him. He was quite a resource to me, a gentleman named Bob Preston. And this is out at Genoa. Shows the side track and the mail crane and the shelter shed. These were all taken right before the abandonment of the old line in 1933. And the dog hole mines and the little cross-tie sawmill operations, they weren't enough to support the continuation of the 12-pole line. This is out in the breeding area, an old sawmill abandoned. See the old log shingle construction over there, which was so predominant all down through along the old line, all down through McDowell County and all that originally. This is Radnor, and Bob Preston had that barn and lived in it on the right, and they'd remodeled it into a house and store, his wife Ethel. So I got to be real good friends with them. This is Dunlow. The station is still standing, albeit in disrepair. There was a lady by the name of Cora Deerfield that owned it, and she kept pretty good care of it and mowed around, but it's all the weeds and everything are growing up around it. It really ought to be restored in some way. There's the station at Dunlow, a little second-class combination freight and passenger station. They had a telegraph operator there. It was quite a village in its day. It had a doctor and a coal company and several stores. Again, some of the little mom and pop stores. This is in the 40s at Williamson. The old roundhouse had been torn down, the smaller one, and that new one on the upper part, or toward the left, is the one still standing and used as a car shop today. But it was the last one to stand, and it's the last. In fact, it's the last roundhouse standing anywhere on the Norfolk and Western system. There's a train coming into Williamson. Back about the time of the war. I had a friend that W.T. Ross was an operating vice president and superintendent of transportation. He was a road foreman between Portsmouth and Williamson and knew a lot of these old men, and we got to be good friends. He just passed away a couple of years ago, and he was coming in with a troop train with a 1204 that on Pearl Harbor Day, and the little boys were running up and down the platform with the extra newspapers that Pearl Harbor had been bombed. So this is kind of symbolic of that time. This is the Powhatan era with their not this the Cavalier, excuse me, but that's the streamline equipment that was introduced in 1941, and the J came out, and the first streamlined cars on the Cavalier and the Pocahontas. This is taken at the east end of Williamson from the Kentucky side, and you can see a mountain homestead farm there in the foreground. And again, the war years. Railroads were very patriotic. It was one of the 1200s that were used west of Williamson and east of Roanoke. They could haul coal, and they could haul 175 cars of 50-ton hoppers and time freights and passenger trains at 70 miles an hour. With 42 of them, the 1218 is still in the Transportation Museum at Roanoke, and they ran excursions with it also. This is at Nolan. 1204 blew up there in 1942. The operator there, Bob Ward, telegrapher, his son was killed in World War II, and he copied the message himself that came over the Western Union wire. These are the modernized engine service facilities at Williamson. In 1947. The second roundhouse had been torn down to accommodate that. They go through these lubritoriums and be inspected and lubricated, and they sort of dieselized in theory. N&W by far was the most efficient steam railroad. They built their own engines in Roanoke and had the streamlined servicing. There's out the window of the office. Shows the K1 on the train between Bluefield and Williamson, and the A, and then the Y6. And then these are the three trains that were the primary trains in the later years: Pocahontas, Powhatan era, and the Cavalier. This is the first Powhatan era leaving Williamson on its maiden run in 1946. And that's the crowd that came out to see it, part of it at the east end of the platform. Those locomotives and that train were quite the thing in those days. That shows the westbound train, the crowd that came out to see it, the first train. Those houses built up there are called Russell Steps. I had a friend of mine that his dad had one of them, and he grew up there. This is the modernized station that they did modernization in 1947 and 48. New shelter shed and baggage building, whatever. Interior of the depot, that once it was modernized, this is the way it looked right before it was given to the city. You can see the newsstand over there on the left. Union News Company. This is the new Powhatan area. Even though they had rebuilt equipment for it in 1946, they ordered new equipment from Pullman Standard in 1949, and the train was absolutely beautiful. It was America's last great steam train, and that's on exhibition. They had an exhibition run, and that's at Williamson. Class J with extra flags. This is that round-in observation. They called that the boat tail. Had the 581, the 582, and this is on exhibition at Williamson. Those things were absolutely beautiful. I can remember them well, and they took those off in 1957 and sold them to Saudi Arabia. And I got involved with a group that located one of them and tried to get it back, but they'd scrapped it before we could do that. CSX owned Sealand, and I was trying to work it out to bring it back on one of those ships. Again, this is Williamson and the coal yard. It's toward the end of steam. That building on the left, 4 stories, is the old yard office. That's just been replaced by the Bill Fox building. There's a piece of that script from Pond Creek Colliery of N&W, dime. That structure way over there on the right in the middle was the coaling station. And you can see the mine over to the left in Kentucky, and they had an aerial bucket line to supply that coal wharf from mine mouth right to the coal wharf. Station at Devon, places in southern West Virginia, Mayberry, Devon, English, a few of them. They had Panther. They had 2-story stations that had agents' quarters in the remote area where there wasn't anywhere for them to board or whatever. This is the Tri-State Limited that went down to Grundy, Virginia. It ran extra out of Williamson and then ran as a mixed train from Devon to Grundy on the Buchanan branch. This is at Hurley, Virginia, on that train. Right near where West Virginia, Kentucky, and Ohio come together down in that area below Williamson. Station at Hurley. And 1956 was the last really big coal rush year for steam. This is shown, they had a really movement on to expedite the cars to get as many turns as they could out of them. Keep them rolling was their theme, and those A-class engines played a role in that. Here comes one out with a loaded coal train as the empty train is going back into the yard, and that's shot from the freight station at Williamson, which was built in 1952 and housed the Williamson Daily News where I worked. It was recently torn down. There's Williamson in the 50s. The J's were taken off the passenger trains in July of 1958, and the A's off the Kenova district pretty much in August and November of 1958. Although Williamson was the last place NW used steam, some of the mine run shifters were based there that went up Pigeon Creek into Kermit and some of those places. There's an extension of the yard that was made in the 50s, way down on the east end, shot from the Kentucky side, 2 Y-class engines. This is the running repair car shop at Williamson, where they would work on the hoppers and whatever. This is down at Devon. The old gentleman back there standing between the rail there, with the rail between his legs, is Bill Economopoulos. He was a extra gang foreman, and he was a native of Greece, and everybody called him Bill Greek. A lot of Greeks down around Williamson, and they operated restaurants and all that. I don't know whether anybody knows Sam Caporalis down there, but his daddy, George, and his brother had the day and night restaurant. They all worked on the extra gangs and cooked on them before they opened their own restaurants. This is the 611 in the wreck at Cedar on January 23rd of 1956. Killed the engineer. I had an interview with Ernest Hoback, the fireman, who rode it over into the river, and his hair turned gray immediately thereafter. He was a young man. Took that curve too fast. Luckily, no one else was killed, but that was the last big steam passenger wreck on the N&W. And the 611 was saved and rebuilt in Roanoke, and that's the one they're using now for excursions, which I got to run 4 times. Before they rebuilt it this time, you could see the dents in a couple of places in the tender where they had the dents. And this was the last big steam wreck in 1957 in February at Chatteroy, Goodman actually, as they call it. And that's the 1205 turned over in the middle of US 52. And the fireman, Turtle Eye Tyree, told me that the tug fork was high, and he jumped in it as it turned over, and he felt the top of that cab clip his heels as he jumped. But as I said, I'm the proud possessor of the number plate from that locomotive. And this is the last timetable to have the J on the front. That before they were removed and diesels took over in July of 58. There's a Cavalier at Williamson, 1957. And an A coming out with a train of empties out of Portsmouth by the steel mill down there. These are the last days of steam on the Norfolk and Western at Williamson. Larry Fallure and John Cloran made a lot of interesting pictures there. Very poignant. John was one of the principals in the founding of Cuyahoga Scenic Railroad. These Y6 engines were used on mine run shifters. This is up at Kermit on the house track, 2154. These are all early 1960. Had a few S1A class engines. That's the 225. I have the number plate off of that too, that front number plate hanging off the headlight. The old Cinderella Theater building there. But they had about 4 of these that they used on the yard, and those 4 and a handful of the Y6 engines on mine runs were the last steam on the N&W. There's the deadline down at Bluefield after they were taken out of service. And this is the area where the Ohio extension was joined up down at Raw, West Virginia. The 2 halves were joined there on September 22nd, I believe, of 1892, and I worked with Dr. Frederick Armstrong to do a historic marker on behalf of the Norfolk and Western Historical Society. So it's still there. And there it is in all its radiant glory. That was hard to write all that and get what you wanted to say within so many characters. There's the milepost 466 down there at the bottom where they were joined. They later moved it. It was vandalized up there, so they moved it to an area in a curve on the east of there, about a block. Kind of a poignant shot that shows the main line down the Tug Valley and cut of cars there. This is at White, just east of Matewan, a famous lithograph of the N&W. That's a DeLorme branch there, and that bridge you see that went over to Majestic Collieries over into Kentucky. But that N&W was big on these type of pictures and publicity, and had a really great public relations department. They were proud of their steam locomotives. So that concludes my presentation. That's a clear signal. It's a match cover, but that's the old position light signals like they use. So with that, I'll be happy to answer any questions. I thank you for your attention. Tried to throw a little off the cuff some of the stories and whatever in there, but there's, you know, it's unbelievable, some of the tales and anecdotes. I hope to make this book called The Tadpole Line. I hope to make it my master's thesis. And I even interviewed an old man that was part of the Preston family, that he remembers the right-of-way agent coming, and he was up in the loft of the log cabin out there in the Radnor area, coming and negotiating with his father down at the supper table to buy land for the right-of-way, back about 1890 or whatever. So a lot of things to put in there. All right, any questions? Rick?
Yes, sir. This is a question on 50 and 51, the Cardinal.
Yes, sir.
There's a railroad that's between Chicago and D.C. that doesn't run all on chassis system track. What is that short line railroad in Virginia?
Buckingham Branch.
What's it? What's it?
Buckingham Branch Railroad. Runs between Clifton Forge and over to Orange on that. And then runs on Southern on into the old Southern, Norfolk Southern now, on into D.C. and then up they changed the electric engines in Washington and run on up on Amtrak.
It hangs up there occasionally.
Where they really get hit is Chicago. If you get out of your operating window in Chicago where all those railroads cross, if you get very far out of your window, that's when they start taking the delays and where it gets late. It's late more eastbound than it is westbound.
Okay, there's two sections of track in Illinois. That are 30 miles with no passing sidings. What are the names of those?
That's out there on part of the old C&O and Monon and all that, out through Lafayette and that area. Yeah. But ridership's increased. They keep talking about taking it daily. I was an engineer on it for 13 years, and I made $60,000 more a year working 3 days a week for Amtrak than I did as a vice president at CSX. So I made good use of my time. I didn't spend much time at home, but on my layover at Charlottesville, I would go to the UVA library, and the copies were free, and I'd go through the old Roanoke Times and the Bluefield paper, and just like I've spent up here today working on a lot of things, and that's where I gleaned a lot of that.
There were some reinvestment funds available. How come West Virginia did not take advantage of that? A lot of states did, a lot of cities did.
Well, the Heartland Corridor on Norfolk Southern was where those tunnels were lowered and cut out for double stacks, and a lot of that money in a private-public partnership went to that. But frankly, West Virginia does not contribute much to Amtrak. When I was resident vice president, they had $100,000 a year earmarked for that commuter operation up in the eastern panhandle that marked the Maryland Area Regional Commuter Authority. And they wouldn't write me a check. I had to go to the Court of Claims and get it every year. But if West Virginia doesn't step up, a lot of the new mandates for Amtrak, are requiring the states to step up and participate more in the funding of Amtrak. If West Virginia doesn't step up, I'm afraid they're going to lose this train. They'd like to take this train daily.
See, Florida East Coast has got 2 brand new passenger trains.
Oh yeah. Yeah, it's a lot of these routes have grown on Amtrak, and they're paying for themselves, and a lot of them could support double daily service, a day and a night train now. But they just put a new service on the Roanoke, and that's happened. They put a train from Lynchburg to Boston to serve Charlottesville, and a lot of that short run traffic was taking up the long haul space on the Crescent. People that were going from New York to New Orleans didn't have any space for them. So those trains took the preponderance of that short haul business and opened up the more profitable long haul on the Crescent. But that train's doing really well. They just extended it to Roanoke last month.
You got a tractor trailer turning over daily on Interstate 64.
Tell me about it.
What could be wrong with running a commuter from Huntington to Charleston?
Well, the railroad doesn't want to get into that. The freight railroads don't. They'll gag at a gnat and swallow an elephant. I'm kind of tell it like it is. But we don't have the coal traffic that we had. Coal is not as bad off as they'd want you to believe, but it's still, the haulage is way more than it was back in the old days when the C&O and the N&W were thought as the 2 primary coal roads, and it's where they got all their profit out of. They're still hauling way more than that, but they're not they're not hauling what they were a couple of years ago. The export business comes and goes. Old King Coal's been on the mat many times and gets back up, so I don't know what'll happen. Environmentally, it looks like some real problems. But
I used to be able to, I was 12 years old. I could flag a train down at Eastman, ride to Montgomery, go to the movies, and ride another train.
Yeah, back in the days of the passenger service in C&O.
You mentioned one of the train stops up in just outside of Williamson there, Gray.
Gray, yes.
And apparently they changed it back over to Williamson.
Yeah, that was done in 1901. I had a 3-stall roundhouse at Gray and about a 4-track yard, and you can go down there with a metal detector where the yard used to be in that area and find old Lincoln Penn couplers. Because all that was taken out before the days of magnetized electromagnetic cranes, where they could just sweep and suck up the spikes and all the metal. And so I've been wanting to go down there sometime in the winter when the copperheads and the rattlers aren't out prowling about.
Did the NW use date nails?
Yeah.
When did they stop that?
In the 60s. I've got a total collection of that. If anybody'd ever like to come down, you know, take one of my brochures here. I'm not exaggerating in saying that I have one of the finest private collection of railroad artifacts in the country. I have a depot, an agent's office, just like walking into an old NW country station, and that Fox Network antique show when they were in Huntington, they did a segment from the house. They had the people with their curios down in my living room, and then upstairs in my office. And I can look out and see both the C&O and the NW main lines, CSX and Norfolk Southern. Randy?
You mentioned it was awful rough up in Dingus. My great-grandmother used to catch the train there at Breeden.
Yeah.
And she always mentioned that don't go over in Dingus, it's a rough area.
Yeah, it was pretty mean. Pretty rough in its day. And I remember here back in the 80s, there was a guy that got killed, and he laid in the road like 4 hours before the state police even showed up to do their paperwork and everything on it.
One of my friends, a fellow by the name of Eric Simon, he does a lot of metal detecting there around the Dingus tunnel.
Uh-huh.
And he's found an awful lot of lead and bullet casings and things.
Yeah. Yeah, it was quite a thing, you know. I'll have a chapter on that in my book. They called that bunch up there the Owl Hoot Gang. And they just about hung a woman up there that gave them a venereal disease, and it was, they didn't want anybody, outsiders coming in and working in their area and whatever. And they'd run them out of there. And, those were quite the times. All right, anybody got anything else? I appreciate your attention, and thank you for letting me speak to you tonight. In Crewe, Virginia, and all these gentlemen that operated these trains and ran these locomotives, I would make tapes of them, and I would tell them, look, you know, I know the dry history that this was built in such and such a time and date, and I said, I'm really looking for something more. And I'd say, you remember any unusual little anecdotes or incidents that happened? And I would have seniority lists of the men with me, and I'd go, yeah, that guy, he did this, and this happened to him, or he was involved in that. And then I'd go down the division place by place, you know, from an employee's timetable, and yeah, this happened there, yeah, that took place there or whatever, and that way I got into some really good anecdotes and tales and different things to blend into my writing. So when I retired 3 years ago, I started to get back to my writing. I have the publishing venture. We did the cast book. You can buy that in the gift shop here. It's still in print. And we did a book on the Class J engines of the NW, and that sold out in 6 months. So I started to put a lot of those anecdotes into that and these tales, and I've got kind of a folksy flair, I suppose. I won the award for the best magazine writer when I was at Marshall. So also have a bed and breakfast. Take one of the brochures, feel free when you leave. I have a Smithsonian quality exhibit of railroad artifacts in my house, and have quite a collection and also archives, and you know, someday that may end up here at the state, who knows. But a friend died, Lloyd Lewis, 2 years ago, and I bought most of his collection from his son, and then I helped his son market the rest of it. So he was able to get about $35,000 out of all I was able to help him sell and whatever. So, but I've been involved 2 years with that. He had like 7 storage lockers of things, big storage lockers, and it was just trash thrown in among treasure. So, with that, that'll serve as a good introduction, and I'll get into my presentation. The Norfolk and Western Railroad had its beginnings in 1838 when the little 9-mile City Point Railroad was constructed between Petersburg and City Point down on the James River. Over the years, the Virginia and Tennessee, I was born in Kenova, and both my grandfathers were railroaders. I had one grandfather was a C&O engineer, but I had the pleasure of being a young brakeman and fireman for engineers and conductors that had come up under him. My other grandfather was killed on the N&W in 1926 on the belt line at Kenova in a freak accident that inadvertently involved Henry Ford. Left my grandmother with 4 little girls to rear in the Great Depression. How they made it, God only knows, but they were all very close to me, and they're all gone now. But I grew up in Kenova during the last days of N&W steam, and I could look down off the hill where I lived and see the trains below, and occasionally my dad would take me down to the Kenova Union Station to watch the Powhatan era come in with the Streamline Class J. And then I went to the 1st and 2nd grade in Kenova at Ferndale Elementary, and I could look right out my window and watch in the 1st and 2nd grade and watch the steam locomotives take water, and I was reprimanded occasionally for slipping across Route 75 and hanging out in the yard office, but it kind of inspired a lifelong interest in the railroad. Willis Cook was C&O's PR man in Huntington, and he lived about 3 doors from me, and he took me under his wing and nurtured me, taught me a little bit about photography. I got an interest in journalism and pursued the degree in journalism. Found out you couldn't make a living at it. I worked on the Williamson Daily News for about 6 months, and then I worked 3 years for Congressman Ray Hall, and I hired on with the railroad. One of the first jobs I had was a midnight hostler at Hanley, and I worked with Rick Aguilar here. He's from up in that area, and we worked many shifts together and whatever, but I got over, I became an engineer in less than 2 years after I hired with the railroad, which was unheard of in those days. And then I got involved in safety committees and things, and I took a leave to edit the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers publication in Cleveland. I did that for 2 years, and then the company came to me and asked me to take a position, and I did, and I became a feature writer and traveled all over the railroad from Huntington. Many times I wrote 3/4 of CSX News from right there. Had a really great boss. Soon became regional manager of corporate communications, and then director of state relations and resident vice president, all within 3 years. I worked for a very good guy. I was a native of South Charleston, Dan Green. He was active in state government here back in Rockefeller's administration. So he was a great fellow to work with, and West Virginia was a very important state to CSX, and still is. But I got to do everything from pull a dead engineer from a wreck that he caused as a chemical fire burned all around. You remember the big scary wreck district. So, and did everything from that to personally being in charge of a major visit from the President of the United States. I was the primary White House and Secret Service contact when Bill Clinton came to Huntington and kicked off his re-election campaign there, and we put the train together to Chicago to the Democratic National Convention. And I won't go into it, but I've got anecdotes and stories about all this along the way, but in the sake of brevity, we'll skip over that tonight. I got real interested in the Kenova district of the N&W between Portsmouth and Kenova, and particularly because of the steam engines and the traffic and whatever. So I was a little more mature when I started marshal. I'd been in the Army. First time I went to college, I stayed about 3 weeks and was all torn up over some girl, and I quit. So, but I settled down after I was in the Army and came back, and I put together a poster, and I would go out in the afternoons, and I went all up and down that old line and the big sandy line from Kenova to Williamson. I put these in every church, every country store, any gathering place, post offices, whatever, in an effort to seek material on the old line, as they called it. And so I got a lot of info out of that. Never did get a picture of the old passenger train out there or any really good pictures of the roundhouse at Kenova, but it served its purpose. Another thing that I did was I started oral history tapes, and I would go to Portsmouth and Williamson and Kenova and Bluefield and Roanoke. The railroad was started out of Lynchburg toward Bristol in 1852, and along with the Norfolk and Petersburg and South Side, the three railroads were eventually combined into the Atlantic, Mississippi, and Ohio under the auspices of General William Mahone in 1873. And that lasted until 1881 when it went into receivership and emerged as a product of the Clark interest, Philadelphia financiers, into the Norfolk and Western Railroad. And it was primarily an agrarian railroad from Norfolk to Bristol, 408 miles, and then they got a merger with the Shenandoah Valley Railroad, but it hauled cattle and grains and tobacco and various products of the South. Even its headquarters down through the years had a southern flair in Roanoke. When it became the Norfolk and Western, as did the C&O from Richmond, when it originally came from Huntington. So a lot of your railroad people, particularly in the southern part of the state, were originally southern people, even as far as Portsmouth, Ohio, and places like that. That was settled by a lot of Virginians. N&W eventually called itself Precision Transportation, is what their slogan was. That's a Class A locomotive. That was their time freight engine that could also pinch hit in passenger trains. They had 42 of those. That's the Cavalier at Kenova back in 1957, and if you can look way on down there toward the tower, that's my dad and I standing there. A gentleman by the name of Bruce Myers took this picture, and as I said, my dad would take me down there occasionally, and I can tell by the blue shirt and the white shorts that he wore. So that was kind of his trademark, and I had a T-shirt on, if you draw that up. But these engines were built in Roanoke. There were 14 of them. They were called the finest steam passenger engines ever built. That's the 602. When I was a little boy, we didn't think it was the Powhatan era unless it had the 606 on it. But I was
Welcome everybody to the Thursday night lecture. On Thursday, December 7th, Tricia McClure and 7 George Washington High School students will present Pearl Harbor Remembered. We were there. They've been doing a series of biographies that's associated with the Veterans Memorial out here and actually our online stuff. You can see a lot of them biographies actually on our website. If you go to our website, go down and click on the Veterans Memorial. We'll bring up some other search options for you, and you can take a look through those. Tonight, rail historian and author Tim Hensley will present the Norfolk and Western Railroad, its Ohio extension and Kenova district. I grew up along the N&W in a little town called Crum. And the N&W is one of those railroads where so much passed through that area. And over the years, a lot of it has changed. I'll tell you a little bit about Tim. Tim graduated from Marshall University in 1975 with a bachelor's degree in journalism. He is a former CSX resident, vice president of West Virginia, who served more than 13 years as an Amtrak passenger engineer on the Cardinal. Proprietor of the Trainmaster's House Bed and Breakfast, his Kenova home also incorporates the offices of Pocahontas Productions, a rail and history-oriented publishing venture that first released Cass Scenic Railroad, 50 Years of State Park, A Century of Steam on Bald Knob, 2013. He and his business partner co-wrote 3 Times a Lady, A History of the N&W Class J, number 611, in 2016, and are currently working on books about the N&W Class A, 2664, and N&W stations. Hensley also writes a quarterly column for Rail Fan and Railroad Magazine. Please welcome Tim Hensley.
Okay. Thank you all. Thank you, Randy. He and the staff up here have been after me for several years to come up and do a little presentation. I first put this together back in 1992, the 100th year anniversary of the Ohio extension. We had the Norfolk and Western Historical Society convention in Williamson, so I put that together and made a presentation. So it's still, after all these years, blew a little dust off, and it still serves to tell the story.